Bill Gates is somebody who's done a lot of great things over the years, both with Microsoft and with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Recently, he released his third book and his first one in over 2 decades, which is this one, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And this is a book that I was very excited to read for many different reasons, mainly because it covers a topic that I've been really interested in for a long time, which is climate change. And I believe that is a topic that deserves a lot of attention. And reading the book, I can say that it's packed full of information, and it's basically serves 2 purposes. One, kind of a way to explain why climate change is so important, how fossil fuels and carbon emissions affect our world, and why we need them so much. And it also serves the function of being kind of an instruction manual to how we're going to fix this problem. And it is a big one. And that is why I wanted to make this video, in order to kind of analyze the book, the main ideas, explain the main topics that Bill Gates wants to get across, and in the end kind of give my thoughts about what I think about the whole climate change situation and the book itself. So without further ado, let's get right into the book, starting with the first few chapters, 51 billion to zero and why zero. So one of Bill Gates' main points in the book, and one of the most important, is the fact that every year we as a humanity collectively, like all the countries in the world, release a total of 51 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. And he also explains that it is crucial that we have to get to zero. And by 2050, we have to basically replace all of our things that we do that cause carbon emissions to zero, and he lays out the reasons why. Every single ton of carbon we put into the atmosphere stays there for a very long time, and over time it warms the earth more and more. And this is something that's been proven a lot by scientists all over the world. The vast majority of scientists agree that humanity is causing climate change, and this is something that is already causing problems. Like, this issue is not something hypothetical that might happen in the future if we keep putting carbon into the atmosphere. It's something that it's already happening. It's already affecting communities worldwide. So this is something that has to be addressed fast, and that's what the book explains. And he also puts out the reasons that we produce so much carbon into the atmosphere, divided into 5 sections. The third chapter of the book is called 5 Questions to Ask in Every Climate Conversation. And the 2 most important points that I got out of this were the 5 main ways we are producing carbon and how we must tackle each one in order to get to zero. And also, I love the concept of the green premium. So Bill Gates uses this concept of a green premium, which basically means the difference between the cost of something that produces carbon and something green, like green energy versus carbon. So for example, if I have a power source that costs $10 to operate, but it produces carbon emissions, and there's like a $15 option, basically the $5 difference is the green premium. So this is a concept he goes over during the book in order to illustrate like fuel, the difference between clean energy and carbon energy, and several other topics. Now, the main thing we have to consider in order to fix climate change is the ways we release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So there's 5 major ones, which is making things, basically all the things we build, the materials we produce, and another one is plugging in, the power we generate. Power that uses, for example, coal and oil and all that stuff would count as one that generates carbon emissions, and also compared to green energy. So we also grow things, plants, animals, our food, our cattle, the animals we eat, the food we eat that we grow, getting around, basically all the ways we use with methods of transportation, for example, cars, trains, everything releases greenhouse gases. And also the final one, which is one that I think not many people consider, is keeping warm and cool, which is the air conditioning and the warming we use. So that also contributes a lot to climate change. And basically, Bill Gates illustrates each one of these points in each chapter. So each one kind of has their own, he dedicates like a whole chapter to explaining technologies we can use to reduce those emissions to zero and the path we must take to get to that. So we'll start analyzing each one, starting with electricity. So the first thing of the big 5 that Bill Gates focuses on in the book is how we generate electricity. So for a long time, humanity produced their electricity through the use of oil, gas, coal, those kind of things, and produced energy that also releases a lot of emissions into the air. And during the whole chapter, he introduces ideas of how we can reduce those, and also how to replace our existing infrastructure with green energy, and how we're gonna do that. So the biggest challenge with electricity is gonna be involving developing countries. The reason is because as countries develop and build infrastructure, they use methods that also generate carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. And a lot of people in these countries live below the poverty line, and Gates' solution, he thinks that in the future, those countries should develop using 100% renewable resources. So it's gonna be a big challenge, but he also thinks that it's gonna be possible. And there are many reasons for this, mostly because of the long-term benefits of green electricity. If these countries are going to keep growing, then they have to start using infrastructure that's going to last for decades, and hopefully also reach the goal that is going to be get to zero emissions. However, there's also great news. He also describes how the green premium, which is the difference between the carbon and the green electricity, is basically zero in developed countries such as in the United States and Europe. Basically what that means is that it is cheaper for us to build and use energy that is clean. And that is a great thing, because it means that more people and more businesses are gonna choose green energy for their businesses instead of carbon energy, which is gonna be a good thing, because in the future, that is the main thing that we need to focus on, and getting the green premiums to zero, and basically realize that in order to reach a sustainable future, we need to make people choose green energy over carbon energy. Then everything is gonna be great. So another point discussed in the chapter that I thought was really interesting is that of nuclear energy. So nuclear energy, I think, gets a really bad rap in the past because of accidents, because a lot of people don't trust it. They think it's an unreliable source, but Bill Gates thinks that it can, nuclear energy is gonna play a very important role in the next few decades. And he has a company called Terrapower, and he also mentions another one called ITER, which is a French, I think, coalition of governments or businesses. And also Kurzgesagt, one of my favorite YouTube channels, just released a video talking about nuclear energy, which is super interesting, and I think you should check out. I love that video. And it has a lot of interesting information that I thought changed my mind on nuclear energy, and I think it's also gonna be a very big thing in the next few decades. So one of the things people misunderstand the most about climate change is that one of the biggest emissions is not really due to the car you drive or the energy we use, but actually the thing that contributes the most for climate change is the materials we produce. So basically the cement, the concrete we create, steel, those kind of industries are some of the most polluting ones, and the ones that release the most carbon into the atmosphere. The three main materials we produce that cause this are concrete, steel, and plastic. And the reasons is because, well, plastic is made of carbon. This is something that we use in almost everything. Plastics and steel produces a lot of carbon because of the chemical processes that go into making these materials. Same with concrete. So how do we actually create materials that don't use carbon when they basically have carbon and polluting elements in them that are basically very important things that make a part of them? So many of the solutions to these problems involve using technology that's at the cutting edge of engineering, and basically use processes that create the same materials without emitting any carbon. The one that he focuses more on the chapter is electrification. So it involves something called molten oxide electrolysis. And this basically helps to reduce the carbon. And while it might take a long time to make these things a reality, so we're probably going to be producing more plastic and steel over the next few decades or so that still produces carbon emissions. But he talks a lot about carbon capture too. I think that is a great technology. It's basically capturing carbon from the air, from factories and stuff, and then reusing that carbon. And that might make a dent in the total that we release into the atmosphere, so that is a great thing. The next chapter is how we grow things, and it focuses on the farming industry. So the farming industry produces also a lot of carbon emissions, and mainly the dairy and meat industry. This is something that is very controversial because I don't think people are going to give up hamburgers anytime soon. I mean, I love hamburgers too, and I just can't imagine a future without them. But that is one of the biggest challenges that we're going to have to face as a society, and it's going to involve like engineering, it's going to involve alternatives, but I think it can be done. This topic of artificial meat is one that I'm also very passionate for because I imagine a future where artificial meat is indistinguishable from regular meat, and we might solve the problem of the carbon emissions and also the ethical one about eating animals. So it's basically two problems in one. But in order to do this, the artificial meat has to be indistinguishable, both in taste, texture, just basically the same thing as if you were eating like a normal hamburger or a chicken breast or anything. But it also has to solve the problem of people receiving the same nutrients they would do when eating meat. So it has to be basically undistinguishable and also from the point of the nutrients. In this chapter, How We Grow Things, Bill Gates also talks about why farming is so important for humans and why it's never going to go away. We're always going to need farming to feed populations, especially in developing countries, and we have to do it in ways that are also renewable and that they adopt these technologies in order to reduce the carbon emissions to zero. And a big problem he poses is that of fertilizer. Fertilizer produces a lot of carbon, and he also thinks that a good solution that we could do in the next few decades is creating a zero carbon fertilizer, and that would fix a big chunk of the problems that involve farming and carbon emissions. The next chapter, How We Get Around, deals with the gasoline we use in our cars, in our ships, planes, and basically all the means of transportation we use that use some form of gasoline, fuel that is not renewable. And surprisingly, they don't cause as many carbon emissions as the other, but it's still important to factor these into the equation so we can get to zero. Now, I was surprised to learn in this chapter how cheap gasoline actually is. Like, petroleum is super cheap. That is why it's so abundant, and people use it everywhere. Like, I am like shocked at how much gasoline and these kind of fuels are part of our lives. But thanks to technologies and companies like Tesla, all the major car manufacturers are making alternatives to cars that will also solve this problem. That will be electric. But as Gates writes in the chapter, these technologies still need to be perfected. The electric cars still have a lot of things that they could improve, including the time they're charging. Also, he thinks batteries are a big problem, especially with ships and planes. Ships and planes are extremely hard to make into electric versions of themselves. This is because it is a challenge of engineering and physics. How much energy can a vehicle store? And basically planes and ships use up a lot of energy. And that means in order to be electric, they need batteries. So it's an issue of space and weight. So in order to basically make ships and planes zero carbon, it needs a lot of innovation. But I'm sure that humanity can do it because, humanity can do anything. So I'm fairly optimistic for that. So the final chapter involving the technologies we use and why they cause carbon emissions is how we stay cool and stay warm. So this chapter basically explains something that people overlook that causes carbon emissions, which is air conditioning and warming. Although it doesn't cause as many emissions as materials or fuel or energy, it's still something to consider, especially because according to the chapter, electricity demand for cooling will triple by 2050. So as many countries develop and climate change starts to heat up the planet, the demand for air conditioning is going to increase. So we need to find alternatives for these technologies that don't use as much cooling. He mentions how a big contributor to climate change from these cooling systems is that of Fgases, called Fgases because of the fluorine that many of these machines contain. So in order to remove that problem, we have to find new inventions that don't use these gases and that can also cool. But he also mentions a lot of innovations that people are working on right now that will fix that problem. So far until now, Bill Gates has only laid out the facts about climate change, the technologies that we use that emit carbon emissions into the atmosphere, and why this is heating up the planet. Chapters 9 and 10 could be considered the most controversial chapters in the book, and I'll explain in a minute why. So chapter 9 basically states that countries that are going to suffer the most from climate change are those that contributed the less to it. And he basically explains a lot of things that could happen if we don't get this thing under control, which could be a food crisis, could be more wildfires like we saw in California and Australia over the last few years, floods like the ones we saw in Houston. There could be many things that could happen and set humanity back. So this is something that has to be taken seriously. He talks about why natural defenses are important, like the Amazon forest, which also burned down last year. This is super important because these natural resources we have help us fight climate change. For example, like coral reefs that are disappearing help communities to feed themselves with the fish. It helps the forests obviously convert carbon dioxide to oxygen. There are many reasons to protect these, and every day that passes they will continue disappearing. And I agree with all this, but chapter 10 is probably, even the title could be considered controversial. It's called Why Government Policies Matter. So in this chapter, and also in chapter 11, How We Get to Zero, Bill Gates explains some ways that we can help businesses in order to reach the zero. And I think the best solution is basically to reduce the green premiums. In other words, to make the green alternatives cheaper than the carbon alternatives. Because if I'm a business owner and I want to grow my business, I'm obviously going to go for the cheaper options. So the key is to invest in research, invest in innovations that basically drive the prices to zero. But he also explains why it matters, how it's worked in the past, why governments can also help the businesses. And he focuses on 3 areas that need to be work together in order to make the world take these carbon emissions to zero, which are technology, governments, and the free market, the businesses, the entrepreneurs, and all that. So up until now, I've explained a lot of the things that come from the book, the ideas exactly as Gates puts them. But now, from this point, I'm going to put a disclaimer that this is just my opinion. So from here on, I'm gonna explain my opinion, what I think about the subject, and explain one point that I think is super important and also that Gates failed to address over the course of the book. So I think it's safe to say that climate change is a very important thing that governments and basically everybody in the world has to worry about. They have to take action in order to reduce these emissions to zero by 2050. But one thing that Gates kind of didn't really mention that much is the anti-environmentalist sentiment that we get from a lot of groups. So this is people who deny climate change, who basically are unproductive to the conversation. Instead of focusing on ideas, they actually deny that the problem exists in the first place. And I expected to see more of this during the book. And I think it's important to address that. Mainly because I think this anti-climate mentality comes because of the government restrictions that, basically governments put on businesses, on entrepreneurs. So basically things like raising taxes on businesses so they choose greener alternatives. And this is something that it kind of has to change, or at least be addressed. Like, we have to be able to let entrepreneurs grow, to be able to, create their own businesses while also keeping climate under control. The important thing is to create incentives for people and businesses to choose the environmental options and take this issue seriously without forcing them through government intervention. I think they think that people who care about climate change and speak on these issues are basically government shills that use this information in order to, basically impose more restrictions, when that is so far from the truth. And this is something that needs to be addressed. Like, we need to steer the conversation of climate change towards more productive areas instead of fighting over whether it's real or not. Like, it's proven to be real by this point. And this is something that I wish he discussed more in the book. One thing I'm glad Gates mentioned in the book is the fact that we have to allow developing countries to grow. I don't think worrying about climate change should be an excuse to kind of limit their growth. I think that we have to invest in technology and resources to help these developing countries to be able to industrialize and grow their farming, grow their technology, also while respecting and addressing the issue of climate change. Overall, I think Gates did a great job with this book. He definitely did his research, consulted the best scientists, and most importantly of all, he took a lot of different perspectives when writing how to avoid a climate disaster. He considered everything from economical things, how all the complicated systems systems of the world interact and how they're going to have to come together in order to solve climate change. This is a great book packed full of information. It was very difficult to kind of assimilate the whole thing to make this discussion video, but I really enjoyed it. So yeah, this was a great experiment for me too. This video is probably the most challenging one I've ever done. A lot of information, but I still enjoyed it. So anyways, thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please share it and like it and comment. And I really enjoyed making this. I love talking about more serious topics, and I would love to make more similar videos in the future, either discussing like a book or, you know, like talking about some contemporary subject. But yeah, I really liked it. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.